Imagine, imagine that you live in a town of 500,000 people, bigger than many US cities, on a thin little island peninsula in the Atlantic Ocean. Imagine that the town's waste plan for the past 50 years has been landfilling garbage and then burning that garbage and landfilling the ash. Imagine that this town's landfill has a 50-year history of mismanagement and blight, including a leachate plume, federal and state air quality emissions violations, noxious smells, and public health concerns. Imagine that the community living closest to the landfill is a Black, Latinx, Indigenous, working class community with a high population of children, many under the age of 5. Imagine that this particular community, adjacent to the landfill, has the lowest life expectancy in all of Long Island. Then imagine that you are living in the midst of a climate crisis. Imagine that incineration, burning waste, is toxic and polluting. Imagine that new incinerators and ash fills are almost impossible to build in this country in this day and age. And so those that exist, usually placed decades ago next to communities of color and or poor communities, are expanded and refitted as the last gasps of a dying industry. Imagine that in 2017, a documentary was made about the adverse health outcomes of the students and staff at a public school near this landfill. Imagine that in the midst of the anguish and fear of the parents, teachers, and community members, town officials promised that the landfill would close down when it reached capacity in 2024. Then imagine that these same town officials do very little to plan for the closure of the landfill and instead apply for and win a state grant not to close the landfill, but to expand it by building a new ash fill next door to it. Imagine the community's mistrust, the frustration, the uncertainty. Then imagine that the community says enough is enough and closed means closed. Imagine that we say we will no longer accept the town's mismanagement and lack of planning, that we say human life is worth more than tipping fees, that in 2020 we can do more, we can do better than burn increasingly large amounts of garbage and fill up holes in the ground until they become mountains, and then dig new holes next to the old ones again and again until the land spits us out. It's time. Enough is enough. Closed means closed. This was a social media post that I wrote in October before one of our landfill protests. Hopefully, if we have time in the Q&A afterwards, I can share the rest of the story about where the fight to close and clean up the Brookhaven landfill is right now. Thank you for inviting me back here today. I'm cognizant that there's a certain cyclical aspect to my return to the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Stony Brook and to this pulpit. I'm grateful for your desire to remain in community with me as the years pass. I'm thankful to have this space to come, listen, and share again. In the past, you invited me to talk about the Black Lives Matter concept and about what it might mean in Eastern Long Island. Today, you have asked me here to talk about Earth Day as we approach the 51st anniversary of this holiday, and to share a little bit about my work as part of the Brookhaven Landfill Action and Remediation Group, or BLARG. Before we march towards Earth Day and talk about BLARG, though, I have to return to one of our earlier meetings. I believe it was in the year 2016 when I first came to this pulpit to speak. When I was last here then, the fellowship was in the midst of some heavy discussion about a Black Lives Matter sign that kept on being stolen. A Black Lives Matter sign that made some of the fellowship's tenants and members concerned and fearful. A Black Lives Matter sign that spurred an intense discussion within this body about who you were and what that meant. In 2016, after I spoke, I remember some questions were raised about The fact that these three words strung together, Black Lives Matter, might be divisive, unnecessarily exclusive. These words, Black Lives Matter, some worried, sought to prioritize a particular population, to lift up a small slice of the human community above others. Now, these concerns are not unique to this fellowship, obviously. The retort, all lives matter, is a crystallization of this fear, this suspicion that Black Lives Matter is somehow standing in opposition to our shared humanity. So when we spoke in 2016, I tried my best to explain the vision of interlocked and interdependent freedom, buoying up these words, Black Lives Matter. I may have referenced the Combahee River Collective, a Black feminist socialist organization in the 1970s, who theorized it clearly when they explained that if Black women were free, it would mean that everyone else would have to be free, since our freedom would necessitate the destruction of all the systems of oppression, unquote. I'll say that again. If Black women were free, it would mean that everyone else would have to be free, since our freedom would necessitate the destruction of all the systems of oppression. The Black Lives Matter guiding principles geared toward explaining the BLM concept to children states this vision of interlocking freedom in this way: to love and desire justice for ourselves is a necessary prerequisite for wanting the same for others. Perhaps the simplest articulation of this idea that I've heard is a chant that you often hear at protest: all lives will matter when Black lives matter. Now, the difficult thing about accepting that a vision of interlocking freedom requires setting some priorities is that this flies in the face of everything we have been taught about how power actually works within our national history. What happens to my freedom? The All Lives Matter crowd wonders if I fight for and center the rights of someone else. This vision of an interlocked liberation seems unbelievable in a country like ours, founded on settler colonialism, forged through the transatlantic slave trade, and built up on a steady diet of war and the pursuit of wealth. In a country like ours, power is usually mapped onto domination. And so there are those who hear the words Black Lives Matter and hear them through that lens. This can only be a trick, a way for Black folk to grab resources and power. Even those with more liberal sensibilities can often start to wring their hands, wondering whether the framing is too divisive and may lack traction. So even though our political heritage in the United States tells us that freedom is something to be hoarded and that our power comes from our ability to dominate resources, the earth that groans under the weight of our collective choices and history tells us another story. What is our responsibility in this season of floods and droughts, of wildfires and pandemics? The earth is teaching us a lesson, new lessons about where we are and when we are. We are being offered new priorities. As we confront a climate crisis that will not be denied, our inherited understandings of progress and power must shift. Part of what this past year has taught me is that given the time it is on the clock of the earth, there is no greater priority than community. So that is my topic for today: strategic community in the time of the climate crisis. And I will use my experience in Blarg to talk a little bit about what I mean by community and strategic community. So I'm a member of Blarg, a community coalition that has come together since the summer of 2020, in the aftermath of the George Floyd murder and in that summer of uprising. At that time, advocates and activists from North Belport came together to insist that Black Lives Matter must have a local agenda and that in Suffolk County, we could not say Black Lives Matter without also saying something about the Brookhaven landfill. The Brookhaven landfill, as I've often said, is a grave environmental injustice hiding in plain sight. In 1974, the landfill was built next to one of only two majority Black neighborhoods in Brookhaven town. And since then, the landfill has expanded and grown and has become a particular blight on the working class community of North Belport. There are 50 years of toxic odors, 50 years of complaints. The properties of North Belport have been impacted by their proximity to the landfill. The public school district has been impacted. This landfill has a long record of mismanagement. This has been a troubled site for decades. It has been fined by the US EPA for violating the Clean Air Act to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars. Something is wrong. And even as I say this, I also want to acknowledge the beauty and resilience of the North Belport community. There is so much innovation, so much talent, so much heart and history and pride and genius in this community. And the landfill is a limiting factor. It constrains the construction of affordable housing. It destabilizes the school district when staff leave because they're concerned about their health. It takes away people too soon. For all these reasons at Blarg, we center and prioritize the human experience of North Belport, the fence line community that has borne the brunt of the region's waste needs for the past 5 decades. We recognize that the landfill has been a toxic neighbor to families who are breathing in the noxious smells, whose mental and emotional health is being impacted, whose ability to gain equity and wealth in their homes is being impacted. We are also clear about one thing. The Brookhaven landfill is not solely a North Belport problem. Today, the Brookhaven landfill accepts the waste of approximately 2 million people or 660,000 households. Every year, around 700,000 tons of construction and demolition debris and 350,000 tons of incinerator ash are deposited into the Brookhaven landfill. This landfill is a linchpin in Long Island's regional waste infrastructure. And so all of us in this room, I would argue, are connected to the Brookhaven landfill. In our highly segregated Long Island, the landfill is one thing we all have in common. Our Brookhaven town elected officials in both political parties have historically embraced the landfill as a cash cow. It has been shielded from scrutiny because its net revenues account for a certain percentage of the town's operating budget. And so for decades, the complaints of the proximate communities have been brushed under the rug. When we understand that the Brookhaven landfill is part of our collective story, as we often say at Blarg, we realize it will take all of us to close the landfill and get it cleaned up. When the Brookhaven landfill completely closes, it will be because we have come together as a community and pushed our local and state governments to develop a rational, regional, and sustainable plan for waste management. In other words, we will have embraced our own power as a public and asked our elected officials to be in better relationship with our earth. When the Brookhaven landfill is finally cleaned up, it will be because we have come together as a community and pushed our governments to acknowledge the harm of the past decades and to prioritize economic, environmental, and social redress for those who have been impacted. In other words, it will be because we have embraced the importance of historical justice and been able to actually do that in our own setting, in our own communities. The existence of the Brookhaven landfill, which allows the town to profit from the cycle of burn and dump, has protected Covanta Energy, the multinational incinerator company operating on Long Island, from scrutiny. Now, Covanta is one of the biggest single polluters, one of the largest sources of emissions within New York State. So when the landfill finally closes, it will be because we care about leaving a habitable world for our grandchildren. The landfill closure is the impetus for developing and committing to a zero waste plan with clear and measurable targets for reducing and recycling our waste. It is an opportunity to put our abysmal recycling rates in the past, to roll up our sleeves and create a plan that actually allows us to be accountable for our waste. When the Brookhaven landfill finally closes, it will be because we have come to terms with where we are, when we are, what our power is as people, and have decided to be accountable for our impact on the earth. So you can see that Blarg's fight for justice for North Bellport is also a fight for a livable future for us all. It is a fight for an ethical relationship with our neighbors near and far and with our earth. I would like to share a short video clip at this time of comments made by Supervisor Edward Romaine at last week's Long Island Metro Business Association meeting. After speaking about the solid waste crisis last week, the town supervisor opened himself up for a Q&A period. At that time, I asked a question about why environmental justice concerns were not a part of the supervisor's presentation, and specifically why the experience of North Bellport residents was not a part of the supervisor's presentation and plan. So this was the supervisor's response to me. I will just share my screen at this time. And get to the right video clip.
People. Abena, for example, does not live in North Bellport. She lives in Brookhaven Hamlet, in one of the wealthiest communities that we have on Long Island. So for her to speak for North Bellport is somewhat disingenuous.
The supervisor's statement was that for me to speak for North Bellport is somewhat disingenuous. Now, without attempting to single the supervisor out, I share these clips because it is rare to have such a clear distillation of how an impoverished sense of community can be weaponized to insulate the Brookhaven landfill and other injustices from criticism and to circumvent accountability. North Bellport speaks for itself. North Bellport has been speaking for itself for 50 years. When we as neighbors decide to join our voices with North Bellport and speak for a just and sustainable transition to a fair waste infrastructure, that is the opposite of disingenuous. It is strategic community. For Supervisor Romaine, my home's location in Brookhaven Hamlet somehow invalidates my concerns about my neighbors. He drops my address as though the location of my home somehow makes it impossible for me to care about conditions that are past the end of the road. Perhaps the supervisor does not know that before I was a resident of Brookhaven Hamlet, I was a Black woman in America. And that for me, injustice, wherever it is found, is definitely always my business. Perhaps the supervisor does not know that long before I was a resident of Brookhaven Hamlet, I was a follower of a Middle Eastern teacher and mystic who posed the question, who is my neighbor, as a life ethic and a policy program. Perhaps the supervisor does not know that before I was a resident of North Belport, I was a resident of planet Earth. And that relationship requires that I speak out in defense of the Earth. One of my civil rights heroes, Grace Lee Boggs, a Detroit activist and revolutionary thinker, it is said, always used to ask comrades, friends, and advocates doing liberation and movement work this question: what time is it on the clock of the world? What time is it on the clock of the world? Now, Grace Lee Boggs posed this question as a way to challenge justice-minded people to consider if their strategies, if their choices were actually aligned with when and where we actually are within historical time. In some ways, right, this is the same question that the climate crisis youth activists have been shouting from the rooftops. How must we organize, live, travel? How must we feed ourselves, considering the clock of the world? So when I consider the clock of the world and what time it is, I believe it is time for the Brookhaven landfill to close and to be cleaned up. I believe it is time for the public within Suffolk County to have a sense of strategic community that requires that we speak up for our neighbors and understand that their fight is also our fight, that their liberation is also our freedom. So what time is it? UUFSB, what time is it on the clock of the world? Thank you.